Okay, I'd like to thank everybody for coming on behalf of the Ink Tank and the Blueberry Patch. I'd like to thank the Blueberry Patch for hosting this, and of course Martha for being in the lead on the Ink Tank, and Kurt for the video production. I'm going to do the usual reading that Peter Duffy was always interested in. Comes from a great little book called A Brief English Grammar by Scott and Buck. Buck was a Vassar College professor at the turn of the last century, and this is what she had to say. It is sometimes said that grammar is a collection of rules for correct speaking and writing, but this is not strictly true. The rules of grammar are like a law of any physical science, such as chemistry, physics, astronomy, and the physical geography. These sciences are not a collection of rules telling the winds and the tides, for instance, what they must do, or prescribing how a certain acid and a certain base shall unite. They only report and explain what happens. And so grammar does not say to use us directly, you must speak thus and so, but only English people at the present do speak thus and so, for the following reasons. Knowing this fact, we shall undoubtedly choose to speak, so too in order to be easily and precisely understood by others, or to avoid the appearance of eccentricities or ignorance, but the grammar goes no further than to report and explain the usages of language, leaving us to choose for ourselves whether we shall follow them or not. And this goes for the 21st century here in 2014. I'm going to open up with Margaret Leech. This is the second part of the Algonquin Roundtable. Our first part we talked about the famed ones. And these are famed ones, but they're not so famous. So we're going to talk about today Margaret Leech, Alice Duer Miller, Harold and Joan Grant Ross, Franklin Pierce Adams, Haywood and Ruth Hale Braun, and of course the great John O'Hara. And these people were considered secondary members of the group. They were not part of the initial, well, I should not say that. Harold was part of the initial group that started the Algonquin Roundtable. But these people came in because they were part of a larger social network that brought these particular writers that we spoke of last month into fame. These are the people who had the courage to back these past writers. For example, boy oh boy. Hopefully you'll cut that out. For example, Robert Sherwood and Dorothy Parker and that crowd. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about the biography of Margaret Leech. She was born in upstate New York to a very affluent New York family. And as a child, she wrote incredible essays. And she was part of a crowd that, well, she was very close friends with Robert Sherwood. And a lot of it had to do with his Emmett relations. Very arts family, as I spoke of last time. The Emmets were not only were they writers, but they were the portrait painters, the photographers, the leaders in most of the arts at the turn of the last century. Jewelry, fashion design. And Margaret Leech was the person who occasionally financed these paintings and these pieces, these artworks, and this jewelry, and her family did the same. And what was her attraction to the round table? She was a very aggressive woman. Her claim to fame is that she had always said that she was never going to marry. And she always had this little stipulation: if I were to marry, I would marry a man that I would not have to commit sin with. Now, how do we explain that? What does that mean? I hope you might have a quote in there a little bit about her interests. But what she found attractive were men who could pique her intellectual identity. And she found herself attracted to a number of great men at the time. And I'm going to bring up Groucho Marx, for example. And Groucho was part of this group. Of course, he was not a writer. Actually, I don't believe he wrote anything. But he was probably the most well-noted of the Marx brothers for his quips and his quotes. And he was a brilliant man. Now, he performed in early motion pictures, and Margaret found herself absolutely enthralled with Groucho Marx and that kind of man. And what she did is she eventually found herself incredibly attracted to a fellow by the name of Ralph Pulitzer, the heir to the Pulitzer fortune. And they met, they married, and they had a very tumultuous marriage. And she began to write her biographies of history. And the very first biography that she wrote was a biography about Anthony Comstock. And Anthony Comstock was a militant prohibitionist. And he believed that there was no room for drink, no room for smoke, and no room for sex. And he became essentially the commissioner of the police department of New York. Now, the commissioner was an appointed position, and he came from what we call button money. And he financed his way into that appointment. And he was a dirty guy. He played dirty politics. I mean, it was machine politics at that particular point in time in New York society. And she did the first in-depth biography of a man still living. Not a man at the end of his life, but a man still living. And the first person to take a hold of that was McClure. And he said, we have to have this. Now, you have to understand, McClure were investigative the people who worked for the McClure magazine were investigative reporters. Some of the greatest writers at the time and journalists at the time, Sinclair Lewis, Ruth Hale, the list goes on. These people were trying to recognize that there were evils that existed. Everything wasn't just so peachy. And she recognized that there was a motivation behind Comstock. And that motivation was a corrupted motivation on his part. And she brought to light that he was a corruptible guy, And he wasn't all about no booze and no cigarettes and no women. And he wrote it, and she wrote about it. And she won the Pulitzer for it. I believe she was the first woman in biography to win the Pulitzer on investigative biography. So, I'd like to have our guest come up and read a little bit, and she'll come up again and read a little bit more once we talk about some of the others.